leaked audio that has come from supposedly a campaign fundraiser. In it, Donald Trump had very choice words for Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, the presidents of Russia and China.
The audio reveals that Trump says that he threatened not just President Putin, but also China's President Xi Jinping. And this is what he told donors about what exactly that conversation looked like during a private fundraiser last year.
To Putin, I said, if you go in to Ukraine, we're going to bomb the shit out of Moscow. I'm telling you, I have no choice. Republic wants it. Republic. So he goes like, I don't believe you. He said, no way. And I said, way. And then he goes like, I don't believe you. But the truth is, he believed me 10%. I told you this. He believed me 10%. Then I'm with President Xi of China. But I said the same thing to them. I said, if you go into Taiwan, I'm going to bomb the shit out of Beijing. He thought I was crazy. He said, Beijing? You're going to bomb Beijing? I said, I have no choice. I got to bomb them. We're going to bomb Beijing. And he didn't believe me either, except 10%.
Over the course of the last recent period, gentlemen, he's been having choice words with Vladimir Putin, especially as things ramp up in Ukraine.
That was a war that should have never happened. And a lot of people are dying. And it should end. And I don't know, we get a lot of bullshit thrown at us by Putin. For you want to know the truth, he's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless.
Trump, Wall Street Journal, is considering Patriot missile batteries to Ukraine, and he is going to give more defensive weapons. This has come after a massive attack by Russia, where over 700 drones were used. Brian, how about your reaction to all of this?
Well, it's just such a shock and surprise that Donald Trump turned out to be this warmongering neocon. If only somebody could have predicted this and warned everybody that when he was picking his cabinet and picking the worst neocon warmongers in Washington to be part of his cabinet, that this was actually just preparation for continuity of agenda, continued wars absolutely everywhere. There is no scaling back. The only scaling back that is taking place is because the U.S. is literally running out of weapons to fight wars all around the entire planet. So no, I don't think it's a deep fake. I don't think it's fake news that President Trump said these things. He practically says these things in public anyway. He has always said these things in public. But the problem is a lot of people who initially supported or even still for some reason support President Trump it's because they're engaging in selective hearing. They're not listening to everything he's saying. They're just picking and choosing the things they want to hear. They want to believe that he's going to, fight the deep state, even though he is part of the deep state, a servant of the deep state. And so they're ignoring this. But when you continuously ignore this, and as events unfold, and we can see what is actually happening with U.S. foreign policy, it just continues toward constant war absolutely everywhere. And so why would anyone be surprised by him making these comments, past or present or future? I don't understand why anyone would be surprised.
Part of this too is the actions behind the words. Not only does Donald Trump say these things, but they're backed up with real policies. At first it's, we're shutting off weapons, and then suddenly the weapons are turned on, and the Ukraine conflict since Donald Trump came into office has not changed one bit.
I'm old enough to remember when Trump said he will shut down Ukraine war within 24 hours of his election. Does anybody still remember that? But this has been Trump. I mean, I also think the audio is probably authentic. He probably said that he had these talks with Xi and Putin, but this is Trump, whether he actually had those talks with Putin or Xi, that's still open to question. But if he did, it wouldn't surprise me. Basically, that it kind of matches Trump's personality very well. And there's precedents for this. What Trump is doing is actually nothing new. Richard Nixon pioneered the so-called Madman theory. That means, to show the enemy that we're so crazy, we're crazy enough to launch a nuclear holocaust that they will back down. And this is actually kind of goes in line with Trump's Art of the Deal, right? In the Art of the Deal, he said, you raise your demand sky high and you force the other side to come down to the table. So I wouldn't be surprised if he actually said those things. But again, why would anybody taking this guy seriously? After everything he's said and done, why would anybody take this guy seriously? You know, you remember what he said about the tariffs, right? And he, you know, and after a month, less than a month, he backed down and issue a 90 days extension to everybody. Remember what he said about banning TikTok, and then guess what? He issued 90 days extension to TikTok, and he extended again. And this is Trump. You know, like, why would anybody you know, take what Trump says seriously? But you're right. You know, Confucius said, "Listen to one's words, but watch one's action." And Trump, even if it was his intention to shut down the Ukraine war in the beginning, I mean, the facts are pretty obvious. He's not. Even if his intention was to fight the deep state, and then he obviously lost. And I never believed that he was there to fight the deep state. And people think, oh, Trump is going there and to clean out the globalists from Washington. Like, hello, did you see who is his Treasury Secretary? Scott Bessent. Scott Bessent, the guy who was literally the right-hand man of George Soros. You think he was going there to clean out the Wall Street and the globalists? I mean, come on. There's some institutional inertia that's built in for NATO to continue to dig its heel in Ukraine, and there's some institutional reasons why U.S. keep on getting entangled in Middle East, even if there is a faction, I think, in the U.S. national security establishment that do want to cut their losses in Ukraine and Middle East so they can pivot to China to do the real big civilization war against China. But that's I don't think that's happening, because we're still on the 3-front war plan, as said by the co-founder of Palantir, Alex Karp, and he said that, yeah, we can fight 3-front war against Russia, Iran, and China at the same time. So yeah, that's where we're continuing that crazy war path, unfortunately.
Yeah, you know, I agree with both Brian and Carl. And the thing that I think of when I hear all these, you know, fluctuating, insane statements, of course, it is Madman theory, but there's also a US torture manual by the CIA called the Kubark. And they specifically mentioned this technique called the Alice in Wonderland technique. And essentially, the idea is to disorient people. You know, one pill makes you large, the other makes you small, you know, just go up and down all over the place. And ultimately, the idea is to constantly barrage, you know, the counterparty with insane messages and then somehow come back to normal and then go insane again. And it's a way of, you know, kind of completely disorienting and psychically demolishing your victim. So I think, you know, it reminds me of that. And of course, it's absurd. We know that, you know, the continuity of the agenda is very clear and obvious. It's a neocon government, but at the same time, you know, there are people who have fallen for this thin veneer of sloganeering and propaganda. Last thing I'll say is, you know, these tariffs, we'll probably get into them in more detail later, but you know, there are, you know, several dozen countries that are already subject to these new tariffs. And I'm actually worried about the countries that are not on the tariffs, because it looks like each set of tariffs gets higher and higher. And you can see that this kind of, there's a taxonomy of tariffs whereby, you know, the vassals get 25%, you know, the grooming and the groomable get about 30%. And then those who are indifferent but could be swayed are in the 40, you know, 35 to 40%. And then it's going to go up from there. And then at the very bottom, you have 20% for the Philippines, which means that it is the ultimate, you know, rear end licking lackey, if you will.
What's so interesting is that, well, Russia, you know, China has been, of course, not commenting on these words yet. Russia, Dmitry Peskov has said that these comments, they're not phasing Russia because it's unclear whether they can be verified. But also, it's quite clear. Vladimir Putin told Donald Trump, actually in the phone call, what we can verify is that Russia was going to continue on addressing the root causes of the conflict, until they are resolved. And here is what Donald Trump was reacting to, a massive drone strike on Ukraine. And these seem to be happening with more frequency, with more intensity. About 728 from the Western mainstream media, what they're reporting in just a single night. So, Brian, what's your impression of the reality that is being reflected in what seems to be Donald Trump's mask coming off? That's what this appears to be. The rhetoric has completely changed from early in his administration.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, for people who were paying very close attention, it was obvious from the beginning that it always was a mask, a very poorly crafted mask. And as KJ said, it's a very, very thin veneer of slogans. And this is for an audience that wants to believe this, not because it's credible, but just because they're so desperate for change, they're willing to believe anything. And you were talking about Russia discussing the root causes of the conflict in Ukraine. This is what people always need to do. They need to go back to first principles. What are the first principles of this conflict in Ukraine? Why is it being fought? This is not a dispute between Ukraine and Russia. It's not even a dispute or misunderstanding between the United States and Russia. This is a proxy war the US deliberately engineered, using Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia as part of a very well-defined decade-spanning policy of encirclement and containment by NATO around Russia, but also around Iran in the Middle East, and obviously China in the Asia-Pacific region. And so we have all of these conflicts, political interference, political coercion, and capture by the United States, spanning all of Eurasia, obviously even far beyond Eurasia. And it's all to do what? To maintain, to establish, maintain, expand American primacy. That is the neocon agenda. That is what they seek to do. They want primacy. Policy paper after policy paper spanning the entire 21st century talks about nothing else. There is no other agenda. Maximize profit, maximize power. And so if you hear someone talking about doing something that does not serve that first principle, that root cause, then they're probably lying. They're probably telling you something that you want to hear to, as KJ says, confuse people, to put them off of balance. But I'm sure that policymakers in Russia and also China are well aware of this. They have their own decade-spanning plans to counter this threat that is imposed on them by what is essentially US empire. And so, yes, Russia is going to continue fighting in Ukraine. This is about self-preservation. Again, it's not some misunderstanding or dispute. Is about self-preservation against an empire that refuses to respect national sovereignty anywhere, not just Russia, China, and Iran, but even so-called allies. The US has essentially politically captured Europe, and they have used them also as a battering ram alongside Ukraine, but in a different capacity, but ultimately at the expense of Europe, for the benefit of Washington. We have the exact same dynamics playing out in the Middle East. People will argue this with me, but I say that Israel's best interests, actual best interests, are not being served by being at constant war with absolutely everyone around them, their society being heavily militarized. Nor are any of these nations politically captured by the US in the Asia Pacific. Japan, South Korea, their full potential never realized because they are subordinated to the US. And obviously the Philippines never had a chance to develop. They are, for an example, just so people understand what political capture by the US does to a country, it has a much larger population than Thailand, where I'm located in Southeast Asia. And yet Thailand has a much larger GDP than the Philippines, which doesn't make any sense, except when you realize the Philippines were literally a US colony from the late 1800s to 1946, and then since then, a de facto colony of the United States. Again, public money in the Philippines, people's time, attention, energy is directed for Washington at the expense of the Philippines, and it shows. So this is the root cause, not just for Russia, but for the entire world faced by constant pursuit of US hegemony.
I wanted to follow up on what comment you made earlier about the United States being really caught up in a three-front war that Palantir's founder Alex Karp have so boastfully discussed publicly to the Western mainstream media. And it seems that Ukraine, this conflict, it's a forever war. It's one that they can't seem to pull out of. And it doesn't matter that Donald Trump rhetorically said anything at this point, because all of the actions have been escalatory at this point. Your thoughts about this? Why is it that the United States can't seem to pivot in this way that it so hopes to? Because Brian also just wrote an article talking about how the U.S. is still very dangerous despite limitations on its military productive capacity. And at the same time, it keeps pouring whatever it has left into these conflicts.
Well, yeah, I think there's some institutional reasons. NATO exists to contain Russia. There's a lot of jobs at stake, Danny, jobs and careers that depend on this continued hostile stance toward Russia. And Ukraine is linchpin of that. Now, of course, the Trump administration and I think a significant portion of his cabinet wanted to pivot to China, to Asia, but they still think they can what they probably want to do is to have Ukraine as a frozen conflict, sort of what happened after the signing of Minsk agreement. But Russia is not going to fall for the same trick twice. And the right now, especially when Russia is winning on the battlefield, so from perspective of Russia, United States and NATO do not get to dictate terms, but that's a position Trump is not used to, right? U.S. been the unit power for so long, it felt it has the right to dictate the term of peace in Ukraine. But that's not happening. I think this is the pushback taking Trump by surprise. Remember, Trump also has a big ego. This is why he's not happy with Putin, because he thought he was being very generous, extending olive branch to Putin to wrap this up. But Russia, for Russia, this is a more existential issue. The reason they went into Ukraine is because NATO has been building this strength, turning Ukraine as this dagger aiming at Russia's underbelly. They do not want to repeat their mistake with the prior Minsk Agreement 1 and Minsk Agreement 2, where they will have a ceasefire and it just allows the time for NATO to supply more equipment, train Ukrainian troops to reignite this conflict somewhere down the road. No, Russia wants to take care of this issue. They wanted to make sure there's permanent neutrality in Ukraine. There will be no NATO. They want guarantee no NATO troops in Ukrainian soil. Whereas the terms that NATO and Trump were throwing out, it's like, oh, okay, we'll send NATO peacekeepers to make sure that there won't be. No. I mean, the whole point of Russia launching the special military operation is no NATO troops in Ukraine. So I think this is a fundamental conflict this is why U.S. are unable to resolve the Ukraine conflict on their terms, because they can't. Russia is winning on the battlefield. Russia will bring this to a conclusion that's on Russia's term, and the U.S. has yet to accept that fact. As for Iran, we all know Israel have an outsized influence in the U.S. politics. And for Netanyahu, it's imperative to drag the United States into the Middle Eastern conflict, because that he needs to remain the wartime president. Otherwise, he will be in jail on corruption charges. So he needs to expand the scope of Israeli aggression to Gaza, to Lebanon, to Iran. And he needs to drag in United States, because he also understands Israel alone cannot take on Iran. He needs United States help. And this is where why Trump did that symbolic glancing blow at Iranian nuclear facility, because he on one hand, he wants to be like, I think if Israel could have scored a quick victory, Trump is totally on board with that. Because the Israeli strike on Iran initially wasn't an Israeli strike. It was a U.S.-Israeli joint strike. U.S. provided all the satellite intelligence, refueling for Israeli F-35. And according to to Israeli media, actually the whole negotiation for ending the nuclear program, which is a ruse to lull the Iranian into a sense of security while Iran to launch their sneak attack. So for Trump, I think if Israel were able to quickly cause a regime collapse in Iran, Trump will be totally up for that. But what he's not up for is to drag into another quagmire like Iraq, because even Trump understands that's deeply unpopular in the United States. As we saw, even within the MAGA camp, many people were against dying for Israel. And so this is why he thought he could thread the needle to launch the symbolic strike against Iran, but telling Iran several days in advance, like, okay, we're gonna attack, but please don't retaliate. We just gotta do this, but don't retaliate. And this way he kind of takes the pressure from Israeli lobby and say, hey, I did my thing. I stood by Israel. I took out Iran's nuclear facility. Now give me a Nobel Peace Prize. And because United States at this point, it doesn't even have, I don't think US even have the capacity to launch a ground invasion, because that's what's needed to do a regime change in Iran. Though we saw they thought they're gonna like launch some strike and Iran government is gonna fall, but it turns out Iranian people, being very patriotic people, they rally around the flag. So they couldn't do like what NATO did in Libya. When the NATO bombing started, they just found some opposition to march on the capital. That wasn't happening in Iran. The only way they could do that is if they send in ground troops. And I don't think US even has the capacity at this point to launch a ground invasion of Iran. Because back in 2003, they moved 170,000 troops to Gulf to start the Iraq invasion. Today, I don't think U.S. even have the capacity to ship 170,000 troops to Middle East on a short notice. And so this is why the Middle East is going to keep on simmering, because there's a slight conflict of goal between Israel and United States. U.S. want Israel to be its proxy, to destabilize Middle East. Whereas Netanyahu wants Americans to do the bleeding for Israel. So I think because of that, U.S. will continually embroil in the Middle East, but I think I don't think any kind of full-scale war is in the cards between U.S. and Iran. And which brings back to China. They're never going to pivot to Asia. They're never going to pivot to China, despite the rhetoric. They keep on saying that we got to pivot our resources to Western Pacific to come from China. But if you actually watch what's actually happening on the ground, contrary to the rhetoric, they're actually retreating. Now they're pulling back from the first island chain. The first island chain being this is a Cold War term when they created the so-called first island chain to contain Soviet Union and China that stretched from Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, Philippines, all throughout South China Sea. But they have been pulling back from the first island chain back to the second island chain. Now they're trying to hardening their hold on Guam as a forward base. But recently the Chinese Navy just sent two carrier attack groups that broke through the first island chain and did their own freedom of navigation patrol around Guam. So now even the second island chain is looking wobbly for United States. So I do not think they will ever be able to pivot to Asia just because the U.S. empire has been bogged down on so many other fronts.
One of the approaches, or maybe the main approach from the Trump administration, that is almost like an exercise in branding, because Brian outlines the deception, Carl outlines, you all outlined the deception quite clearly, but the actual direction appears to be almost a misguided hope that Vladimir Putin would just settle and pause this conflict, that Israel, if there's going to be any kind of kinetic warfare in West Asia beyond what's already going on with the genocide, etc., that Israel would just do it all. Meanwhile, Israel is saying, help, give us everything that we need to bomb Iran, so that China could be more of a focus.
Yeah, it's as Brian has pointed out on many occasions, there's this whole notion of strategic sequencing and the division of labor, which is clearly not working according to plan. But it's as, Mike Tyson has said, everybody has a plan until they get hit in the jaw, right? And then all, plans go awry. I think the thing to remember is that ultimately the goal is and always has been China. If you think of it as a kind of a three-course meal, there was a question in numerous administrations. We know that the ultimate goal is China. China is the main dish, but there was a question about sequencing. Do we knock out China first and then, go to Russia for the dessert? Or do we knock out Russia as the starter and go to China and then finish off Iran as dessert, etc.? There were questions around sequencing. And clearly, the Nuland faction was ascendant, and they decided to trigger war with Russia first. Now, there are a couple of issues that became very, very clear. First, the United States has not fought a war with a peer competitor since 1945, since World War II. And in the past 2.5 decades, it really hasn't engaged in war. It's essentially engaged in hunting. It's been hunting, insurgents with high-tech weaponry. And then because of that, it's deluded itself into thinking that it is once again this hyperpower that, as, I think McMaster said, have a plan, be polite, be professional, have a plan to kill everybody. And they thought that they could kill everybody. And certainly they saw Russia as they said, a gas station, right? A gas station with nukes, that they would just polish it off. This was the starter course before they went to the main dish. And of course, they would soften it up and weaken it with economic warfare that turned the ruble into rubble. Well, that didn't work out so well. So they miscalculated on all these different fronts. And now, having realized that, they're trying to pick up the pieces and reorient. And they still, I believe, despite Carl's, optimistic view, I believe that they're still dead set on waging war with China. And they also know that the clock is working against them, because every year they delay the war, China becomes stronger, and the US simply just hollows itself out more and more. And as you can see in these recent wars, not only is the US hollowed out and China strengthening, but the global South, the BRICS countries, are also becoming more and more powerful. They're knitting themselves together like a go board, and they're just becoming more and more harder to resist, to take down simply. And then we can also see, very specific challenges to U.S. war technology. For example, if you look at the U.S. had the greatest single Patriot engagement in U.S. military history during the Iran missile crisis. They moved THAAD missile batteries to Israel. They were using, SM-3s, SM-6s, THAAD, Patriot missile batteries, Iron Dome, David Sling, the whole 9 yards. They were using everything they had. And they were essentially pulverized. Iran said, we're only using 5% of our capacity. And yet the Israelis were pulverized. As they said, there's never been this amount of damage in Israel's history, the Director General of Israel's tax authority. So they were pulverized. And so the US is starting to get a dose of reality, what it means to engage in real warfare, rather than hunt down, insurgents in Toyota trucks, who were sheep herders. So I think there's a real kind of awakening, but I believe that they're still deeply embedded, deeply wedded to attacking China, and still deeply, wedded to the notion that they are the supreme power. It's, as I said before, it's the grizzly bear fallacy. The 6% of Americans believe that they can attack and fight a grizzly bear with their bare hands and take it down.